Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for a fantastic keynote and a beginning to what I think will continue to be a brilliant day of debate and conversation. My name is Jessica Kelly. I'm reader in architectural and design history here at London Met, and I'm delighted to have been asked to chair this first panel on the history of unionisation within the architectural profession. I'm going to invite my speakers. I'm going to invite the speakers to introduce themselves, so I'm not putting on them a sort of something they might not be comfortable with. But we're going to run the papers all together. Our speakers are going to talk for about 20 minutes each. I'm going to give you a polite 2-minute warning towards the end, and then we'll hopefully have a bit of time for questions at the end. We're going to run slightly into our lunch break potentially, but not too much. There'll be plenty of time. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. And I'm going to hand over to Claire. We lost a mic. Do you want this mic? Okay. All right, I'm going to hand over. So let me start actually by just saying something about the panel and why it's important, and potentially also why I've been invited to chair it. So Claire and I, for the last year, have started to work on a joint project about the idea of the architect moving between public and private practice in the second half of the 20th century. So it's of real interest, this idea of looking, as Sarah raised, the issue of collective action, collective bargaining, and this history has not been told. It doesn't exist within architectural history really in a significant way. So I think this panel is incredibly important for starting to tell those histories, and I'm really excited to see it. So over to you, Claire.
Thank you. Okay, so is this just clicking going? Okay, so my paper is called Are We Militant? Professional Politics and the Salaried Architect 1919 to 45. I just wanted to give a little snapshot of the material and kind of methods. It's a very academic framing that I'm using today. All kind of material from institutional archives, the Reba archive in Parsons Green, which contains all their kind of committee and council minutes, all their internal papers, and then also the Modern Records Centre at Warwick, and also our archive here, which holds a lot of the different unions, any union that was affiliated to the TUC. And it's through this kind of grey literature of correspondence and ephemera that I've started to kind of build a picture of the relationships and debates that were shaping professional discussions in the early part of the 20th century. So very much not looking at buildings. So a bit of context, the shape of the profession during this period. First half of the 20th century, the proportion of architects employed by public offices was growing steadily, so about 31% in 1930 to a peak of 45% in 1955, making them at that time the biggest employer of architects. And the scale of the influence that public sector architects had on the built environment is really substantial. 45% of the total national building output was designed from within public architecture departments. So most schools, new towns, or the kind of central urban redevelopment projects. And the remaining proportion largely was commissioned by the public offices. And, you know, really the post-war rebuilding programme was assuring workloads. It gave the sector access to far more financial resource, and that combined with building restrictions on building licenses within the private sector really meant that a job in a public office meant a secure salary and a pension. But it was more than the stability that young architects were being attracted by. They were interested in a kind of broader conception of architecture that included town planning after the war and to the architectural potential of the welfare state. And we're seeing quite clearly that idea of the gentleman architect of the previous century, whose patrons were either wealthy individuals or the church, was a fading reality. So the emerging figure of the architect as an anonymous public servant is really in direct contrast to the traditional 19th century figure of the gentleman architect directly responsible to a client. And as a result, the kind of preoccupations and concerns of the public architect were very different. So I'm going to discuss in this talk how the professional bodies played a role in shaping these identities and representing the changing concerns of the profession in the mid-20th century, and in particular how the first formal union for architects emerged to fill a perceived void in the representation for public sector architects. And really, so much of what I'm saying feels like exactly what we've just heard this morning, and yes, it was 100 years ago. So where's the rest of this slide? There it is. By the interwar period, the RBA had been representing architects for almost 100 years. And they'd been involved in all kind of major affairs of the profession. So we have a situation here where we've got an increasing number of architects employed by local government architecture departments or salaried architects in private practices, this idea of the employees for the first time. And there's a growing feeling that the RBA is just really not concerned with their interests or their welfare. And this quote from Don Summerson from 1942 really makes this point. RIBA members were still primarily private practitioners, largely the principals, rather than the employees. And the Institute seems to have little concern for salaried architects, either in public or private practice. So as a response to this growing discontent within the profession, a group of salaried architects came together to start a specialised union. Initially, they were called the Architects and Surveyors Assistants Professional Union, very catchy, formed in 1919 within a committee room at the AA, as many groups seem to. And within a year, they had branches in most large cities in the UK. They represented about 60 to 70% of salaried built environment practitioners, not just architects. And that also included private practitioners as well, but within architecture, it was mainly the public sector employee that were a part of this union. They were registered under the Trade Union Act in 1922. So the names of the unions I got listed here, they're all the same union. It just reflects their changing name over their period of activity. And quite rapidly, the union became the principal outlet for architects critical of the bias within the RBA towards private practice. And I think it's interesting to kind of note here, as the changing name, as you can see, the changing name suggests, they did represent a wider professional base than just architects. And the architects were the kind of most vocal group, certainly as they grew. But it is, you know, notable that they were kind of seeking in some way to unite different professions within the construction industry. This is something that's happening at the same time in the American equivalent of this union called FACT, the Federation of Architects, Engineers, Chemists and Technicians. And this kind of thread of uniting different parts of the built environment profession, I think, is one that may come up a few times today, actually. So what kind of things did they do? Here's a little snapshot of ephemera from the archive. This is sort of things they did in the 20s and 30s. So on the left, you've got a public demonstration for minimum salaries, middle materials promoting the services of the built environment professional, and then material aimed at women to take up jobs within the industry. So quite broad range of activities. In 1924, they changed their name to the Association of Architects, Surveyors and Technical Assistants, and they restated their objectives and also their benefits. So their objectives included what you might expect from a union: ensuring adequate pay and conditions of service, training, protecting professional interests, safeguarding professional status. And their benefits included employment bureau, legal advice, sickness and employment benefit, representation on the RBA Council, so still seems to be relevant, and on its architectural education board, a library, a printed journal, tours and site visits, lectures and social events. And I wanted to draw some attention to the journal, which I think is really interesting. And in fact, some issues are in the cabinet at the back here. It was called Keystone, and it was printed throughout their existence from the 20s until the end, in the end of the 1960s, published monthly. Very much changes in form and design throughout the period, reflecting wider events, so massively reducing in scale and format during the war. Also reflected trends in graphic design. It's quite nice as an object in itself. It changed from a magazine type format to more of a trade union bulletin or kind of newsletter in the late 30s. And by the mid 60s, when membership, as I'm going to go on to show, had drastically reduced, it changed more into a leaflet because their funds were tight. So it's kind of very interesting, you know, not scope within this talk, but to trace the history of the union through this magazine. I'm going to show you some articles, the types of things they talked about. So it was their kind of main way of communicating with their members. So it did contain a lot of the kind of formal mechanisms of the union, statistics and so on, as well as editorial pieces in a more magazine kind of journalistic style. This particular article is about union numbers, a kind of call to arms type tone. It makes direct comparison to another built environment union, the operative engineers, and saying, you know, they have serious influence within the construction industry because of the size of their union and the collective action that affords. I did think it was interesting, they kind of, you know, they're trying to get people to join, but actually through the magazine, they're presumably preaching to the converted, but it's very much a kind of promotional device. I thought, next slide, I picked out this article, The Robotization of Architects, which really feels like it could have been written today, reflecting on the loss of the architect's role as early as 1929. The very end of the quote, I think we could read this today. The all-important design is made by heaven knows who, certainly not by the over-busy architect, probably by the steelwork engineer in collaboration with an assistant good at facades. So not much has changed there. There are also practical articles. This one, galvanizing union members during the war. General articles about key issues, knowledge sharing, articles about housing, for example. And then they did a range of technical work from the mid-20s to the mid-30s in particular. They produced technical publications and research documents, again, of interest to the broader industry, not just architects. And they were producing these partly to kind of gain that respectability and usefulness, but also to build relationships with other parts of the industry. So that was a bit about the union and their relationship with the RBA, as you might imagine, not particularly smooth. Throughout the 1920s, the Asta, as they are then, is gradually building in size. It begins to lobby the RBA more and more strongly. It's successful in securing seats on the RBA Council and its committees. And in 1928, the RBA establishes a salaried members committee, which includes a high proportion of Asta members. And the main discussion point through this period in the 20s is the issue of professional registration and the protection of title. The Asta, the union, they don't see any value in this. And this really heightens tension between the RBA and the union. And they say the majority of the profession are in many cases confused as to the real meaning and purpose of the Registration Act and are unaware of its importance to their status, remuneration and prospects. By the 30s, the relationship with the RBA has really broken down. The RBA refused to support Asta's key concerns around salary scales, limiting numbers entering the profession, and so on. And in 1934, Asta write to the RBA, the letters up here, saying they must cease to be a body officially associated with the RBA, explaining then that it has been established that the RBA cannot negotiate the question of salaries with employing bodies. In the circumstances, therefore, the association conceives that the continuance of the Salaried Members Committee of the RBA can serve no good purpose and can only deceive members of the Institute as to the real position. In the view of the association, the whole effect is to proclaim the RBA an employers' organisation. Very much relates to what Sarah was saying earlier. So all the Asta members resign from the Salaried Members Committee, the RBA Council and the RBA Board of Education. So at the moment when the union is at its kind of greatest period of growth, relations with the RBA are at the absolute kind of lowest ebb and greatest point of tension. And kind of interesting to consider the changing profile of the public architect running alongside this. As more architects joined the public sector and that kind of goes hand in hand with the union growing in numbers, since so many of the union members are public sector architects. There's also a turning of the tide within the profession more broadly. So where the public architect had been considered merely a bureaucrat in the early 1930s, By 1938, when the then RBA president referred to the work of public sector architects as stale chocolate, it was actually met by uproar in the architectural media, whereas earlier in the 30s, it was kind of more accepted that it was lesser quality. By 1946, we could argue that the image of the public architect has experienced a complete transformation. They are now sort of leading the profession. They have far more influence and respect. And the first public sector architect is elected president of the RIBA. So this is very much a period of changing status and this kind of shifting into interdependencies between the public sector and the private sector. So the 1940s, as I think I've established now, are perhaps the high point for this union, both in terms of their number and their influence. And this quote, and again from John Summerson, sums it up well. He says, "It's a remarkable body, this Asta. The crisis of the 30s infused it with vitality. It greatly enlarged its membership. It flushed a deep political colour. In many aspects, Asta came to fill the role originally proposed by the Mars Group, but which that round table of architectural highbrows was too supine and introvert to perform. Today, Asta represents in the most clear-cut fashion the left wing of architecture." So this sets the scene really for the politicisation of Asta, who became affiliated with the TUC in 1939 and changed their name then to the Association of Building Technicians, the ABT. And I think this change of title is noteworthy. It kind of indicated this removal of hierarchy and division between professions. So there's no longer mention of architects, surveyors, any of these other professions in the title. They're all building technicians. Reflects an idea of an integrated industry and also the way of working within public architecture departments where all disciplines are under one roof. And this kind of move gives them greater credibility within the trade union and labour movement and suggests a kind of reorientation. Indeed, the ABT, the Association of Building Technicians, very much identify salaried architects as middle-class technicians, they say, rather than the kind of professional middle-class elite. This article, published in 1947 in an issue of Keystone, describes this new militant middle-class professional who's willing to strike for better paying conditions, suggesting this has emerged from their time in military service during the war, which gives them a sense of collective action that they hadn't experienced before. And they align the salaried architect with the figure of the worker. And they say, "It may be argued that middle-class technicians have never struck before, but neither have they ever been offered the scandalously low wages they are offered today. That's a typo. Never have they ever been so militant. Anyone who disregards these facts is missing the historical changes of this epoch." They published their new charter shortly after they've affiliated with the TUC, setting out a much broader set of aims and a more political tone. They say, "We shall not be satisfied until Britain's legacy of sprawling industry, traffic muddle, benighted villages and overcrowded, slum-ridden towns is only a memory." And I suggest really this is the high point of unionisation, I think, in the history of the profession, and really the only time that architects unionise in very formal terms, historically up until today. And we'll hear more about today's unions later, but it's not really how the story ends, unfortunately. Although they had sustained considerable growth, so they grew from 800 members in 1939 to 3,000 in 1945. Even at their peak, they're still only a quarter of the size of the RBA's membership. And the problems just kind of got worse in terms of them being able to recruit members as the ideological climate changed in the 1950s. So that immediate post-war swing to the left with its kind of collectivist ideology is eroded. There is also an increasing hostility to communism, which made the ABT's quite Marxist position more and more untenable for many of its members. And the case for an acceptable argument for joining the ABT had to be made. 1954 also saw the end of building licenses, so there was a massive growth in private sector work, and architects began very slowly to be leaving the public sector as there was a more buoyant economy. So all this means that the ABT really remains a very marginal group through the 50s. And although they're still critiquing the RBA, is very much kind of from the edge. Unfortunately, by the mid-60s, they have very little influence and cease to represent architects altogether. And I wanted to end on this quote, which I think reflects quite well the general kind of pervading feeling that architects have had historically to union activities. Again, this is a piece from Keynote magazine, Keystone. There are many reasons given or concealed as to why architects do not join the ABT. The architect approach to join says, I'm an artist, an individual creative artist and a professional man. As an individual artist, the creator of a building, you are asking me to join a body in which I shall be only one among other technicians, surveyors and engineers who have a different approach to building from mine. As a professional man, you are asking me to join an association which is linked to the trade union movement, to associations of working men, even to organisations of workers in the building industry, whom I suspect to be political, and political in a way which I do not approve. And he refuses with a shudder, which I think possibly sums up the feeling of some architects, even today, maybe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. That was brilliant. Can I invite now Aska Welford, who's going to be talking about building solidarities, learning from construction and public sector workers.
Are they just? Yeah. So I'm going to take us a little bit sideways outside of architectural work to construction and public sector workers. And I guess some personal context for these histories. So my dad worked and has been disabled by his experiences of manual labour, precarious contracts, night shifts. And my mum has worked in a very heavily trade unionised sector as a childcare worker here in Tower Hamlets, the borough where we are. So together with local parents and her colleagues, she managed to stop the children's centre where she worked from being shut down, opposing the cuts of austerity. And I grew up in council housing here in Tower Hamlets in the 90s. I experienced decanting, regeneration, moved to the edges of the borough, and I went on to work in practices delivering estate regeneration and, yeah, some social housing. I'm a founder member of SOAR, the Architectural Workers Union here in the UK. And yeah, another kind of connection to the practice of history making and relationships to history. So SOAR was founded through an 18-month process of workers' inquiry. So that's a centuries-old tradition of study from below, so peer-to-peer research, and we connected with and archived the previous trade union and architecture, which grew out of the new architecture movement, becoming BDS TAS in the late 70s. So yeah, this feels like very alive and living, and yeah, the streams of time always overlapping and crossing, finding inspiration. Okay, so another context, what am I reacting against? And we've heard this narrative again and again, I'm sure we will again later today. Architects have followed a self-aggrandizing project that places them as the only authors of architecture. This has rendered invisible all the other workers necessary for the production of architecture. The draftspeople, the assistants, the office cleaners, clerks, security guards, receptionists, administrative staff, technicians, BIM managers, document controllers, construction workers. And this is the legacy of the profession that we contend with, an uneven distribution of power in society and indeed in the architectural office. So looking at the profession today, one would be hard-pressed to deny that is perhaps permanently in crisis. Wages have stagnated, fees continue to drop, architectural education is unaffordable, our cities are being gentrified, and we sit on the precipice of climate catastrophe. So these myths around architectural production also serve, in my opinion, to obfuscate means of transformation, which I'll explore today. So unionisation. So we're looking sideways here at other groups of workers for inspiration, for transformation. So construction workers. And yeah, I'm really pleased to celebrate the fact that SAW moved union branch last year in October to affiliate with Unite, the trade union. And it's really exciting to now be in the same trade union as construction workers, which has already offered opportunities for solidarity around major building schemes in the UK. Here in the picture are some building workers on strike for secure contracts, sort of a precarious day rate and fair wages. In the 70s, many building labourers were from Ireland and the Caribbean. When people understand their shared class position, powerful action can be taken. What are the differences between architectural workers and construction workers? When building alliances, we must not erase differences. These differences are material. The majority of construction workers were forced onto the construction site during the COVID-19 pandemic. The majority of architectural workers were able to negotiate to work from home. And at its most extreme, these differences between workers can be deadly. The construction worker is notoriously under-unionised, with well-documented union-busting tactics from large contractor firms. But construction workers have also taken action in solidarity with communities and the environment. So we're really inspired by the green bans in Australia. In 1971, 13 local women around Kelly's Bush in New South Wales, Australia, called on the Construction Workers Trade Union, the Builders Labourers Federation, BLF, after the local parkland, Kelly's Bush, was threatened with development as luxury housing. So over the next few years, billions of pounds of development across the region was halted, saving working class neighbourhoods and ecologically significant Indigenous lands from destruction. So this is a really strong example of successful solidarity between workers and communities. And at this scale, it was only possible because of the extremely high level of union membership density, making it impossible to bring in scab labour. Teams of construction workers would down tools on various sites and walking out in protest as a form of escalating pressure and making it impossible for demolition to go ahead. So, yeah, this monumental force to reimagine development, not in the interests of the rich, but instead oriented towards communities through the allied unionisation of workers, was only stopped when the union BLF was deregistered and struck off. Many of the prominent strikers faced blacklisting and were unable to work again. Here in the UK, blacklisting is also a practice the construction workers face and have bravely opposed. So the union busting that I mentioned earlier has been documented over decades. Dave Smith and Phil Chamberlain, who came to speak to us at SAW, are two such workers who have faced victimisation with catastrophic consequences for themselves and their families who depend on their wage. So what if we imagine a heavily unionised architectural sector, which might be able to act in solidarity like the BLF were with communities and construction workers, all those who go together to make the world. What if we can imagine a heavily unionised architectural sector? We can look at a real life example not so long ago here in the UK. So we might take inspiration from architects' departments of local authorities. How was power distributed? Post-war years through to the dismantling of the Greater London Council, followed by the emergence of New Labour in the 90s, tell us interesting things about the changing role of unionised teams of architectural workers. They offered opportunities for working class architects to build neighbourhoods and civic infrastructure for all. So, for example, George Finch, son of a milkman and bus conductor, working at the London County Council and then Lambeth Architects Department. Here, Ruth Lang points out that the regular wages and financial stability of council employment, I think that's what a lot of us in SAW are fighting for, but that also supported greater freedom to work experimentally. They could be incredibly hierarchical workplaces, say drawings and letters issued, stamped with the signature of the department head, but they were also a contested space and distributed decision-making and greater collaboration with communities were pushed forward by workers. There was a system of accountability baked into the workplace. So I want to talk now about Haringey Council Building Design Service. Haringey Council in the late 70s and 80s was a place of radical change. Here you can see Bernie Grant, former trade union official, councillor member from 1978 and council leader in 1985. John Murray, a founder member of the New Architecture movement, who I got to know through the process of archiving in the Workers' Inquiry that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, the New Architecture movement are really significant. So yeah, feminist women's architecture collective Matrix grew out of it. And as I mentioned earlier, the short-lived private firm of architectural workers, short-lived Architectural Workers Union for Private Firm Workers, BDS TAS, also grew out of NAM. And John told me about how his ideas, which he developed in NAM around community design, as part of the Public Design Service Group, went on to be implemented in practice at Haringey Council. So these ideas were around area-based, so local area control over resources, teams to be based around a neighbourhood rather than around a profession, not sitting in the council offices, but taking over empty units on housing estates. And they were multidisciplinary, not only designers, but also surveyors, engineers, all those involved in maintaining, repairing and designing and building the built environment. There was also flat hierarchies and accountability. So project architects reported directly to committee, and posts between team leader and chief architect were abolished. And yeah, from 1979 to 1985, John Murray worked with other colleagues across the Haringey Council to develop the Haringey Building Design Service, which he was later elected head of. So John told me how changes to the way that the council worked were only possible with a very strong internal trade union. So the National and Local Government Officers Association, NALGO. This was a structure which facilitated workers from different departments across the local authority to be in dialogue with each other and coordinate visions and action. John described to us how the department became a place for women, Black and Asian people to work, with a majority of the workforce in the department from Black and Asian backgrounds. Through the neighbourhood-based approach, apprentices from estates would be taken onto the team and supported through architecture training and sponsored through college. Here is the Broadwater Farm Youth Association outside the chip shop they squatted on their estate, with Bernie Grant smiling in the background. Estate residents were encouraged to form co-ops to directly deliver estate maintenance, as well as new buildings like the enterprise workshops on Broadwater Farm. Coalitions between architectural workers formed within council departments and extending towards community organisers like Dolly Kiffin and Casford Sterling. On the Broadwater Farm estate, this led to remarkable achievements, local labour, including residents in the design of the estate and maintenance delivery of it, who had experienced unemployment and de-skilling, not only carrying out repairs, but building new community infrastructure like the enterprise workshops. So the process of dismantling this, yeah, I've spoken to people who have worked at Haringey Council recently, it's not the same. Yeah, was seen out by New Labour, who saw the threat of a heavily unionised workforce. New officers and councillors manoeuvred with a preference for outsourcing contracts and working with private architecture firms, which posed less of a challenge to their own power in the council. And nationally, the last Borough Architects Department was closed in the early 2000s. So as SAW celebrates its 5th birthday this autumn with upcoming campaigns, not only on issues faced within the workplace, so maternity discrimination, racism, hire and fire, underpay and precarity, but those affecting us all, so the climate crisis or housing regeneration. The possibilities of solidarity between unionised workers and communities are massive. And yes, the forces of opposition are still strong. So yeah, the lessons from construction and public sector workers still need to be heeded, and the inspirations that they hold, yeah, should still ignite us. Thanks.
Thank you, Aska. That was brilliant. Our last speaker on this panel is Ed Bottoms, who'll be talking about I'll Fight You For It, Brian Anson and the Percy Street Atelier.
Okay, hi. My name's Ed Bottoms. I'm the head of the archives at the Architectural Association, where I also teach in the History and Theories department there. I want to start really today by this with this slide. It's from October 1974, and it's the front page of an issue of the Architectural Association's wonderfully sarcastic and very definitely libelous these days student journal called the Ghost Dance Times. In the headline from their seismic correspondent, tremors from a small earthquake, a non-event, are noted as having been barely registered as occurring in Bedford Square, its epicenter being the AA lecture hall. The article is actually a report of an event headlined by Malcolm McEwen, editor of the RIBA Journal from 1964 to 71, and subsequently RIBA Director of Public Affairs, in which he addressed a packed lecture hall on the topic of Can Professionalism Survive? The theme taken from his recently published book, Crisis in Architecture, a book in which he describes the fallen state of the architectural profession, labouring under an economic crisis, inflation, rising energy costs, and caught up in a social and political structure which implicitly supports exploitation of communities and misuse of natural resources. Calling for wholesale reform of the profession and of architectural education, McEwen's report is often cited today as one of the key documents delineating the unravelling of late modernism and the growing sense of malaise and crisis around the architectural profession. Yet interestingly, in its editorial, the Ghost Dance Times is not overly impressed by McEwen's revelations. They're not news to the many gathered at the AA. McEwen is actually ridiculed, characterised as chirurgenically frozen street-fighting man, and I quote, needing daily infusions of adulation in order to stop him slipping into the coma which had robbed the architectural world from his warning voice during the years 1939 to 1974. Equally unimpressed with McEwen is the combative figure of Brian Anson, founding member of the Architects' Revolutionary Council, formed just a few months earlier, who, according to the Ghost Dance Times, sat in the front row of the lecture hall, glaring at McEwen in apoplectic rage, before leaping up onto the stage, seizing the speaker's table and haranguing McEwen and the audience. For Anson, reform of the RIBA was the wrong path. Nothing less than the complete destruction and overthrow of the RIBA would do. Now today, I want to look really at Brian Anson and two of the movements he formed, in perhaps a deeper context than is usually done, working primarily from materials within the AA archives. For those of you who don't know Brian Anson, he was born in 1935 and grew up around Bootle Docks, a working class area of Liverpool, gaining his Part 2 at Manchester University in 1960 and working on Graham Shankland's Liverpool City Centre plan from 1963. He was subsequently appointed in 1966 as Deputy Principal Planner for what was to become the Greater London Council Covent Garden Planning Team. There, he played a key role in developing the 1968 plan to demolish approximately 2/3 of the area, replacing it with a modern business district, decimating the local working class population who would have undoubtedly been forced out. Sickened by the GLC's lack of concern for existing working class community and for the lack of real meaningful consultation, Anson secretly started to organise local community into resistance. On this being discovered in January 1971, he was removed from his position in the GLC and promptly went to the press, leaking documents and embracing the role of local organiser and activist, armed with specialist knowledge and understanding of the working methods of the GLC. After this very public rebellion, Anson was, unsurprisingly, and in his own words here, unemployable. Nobody would have me, except the Architectural Association, who immediately snapped him up as a unit master. Now, I want to divert a little bit now and to go into a bit more give a bit more context to this. The AA was itself at this time at battle stations as a private architecture school operating outside the university system since its founding by disgruntled architectural apprentices in the 1840s. The AA's governing body had been under pressure following the Oxford Conference on Architectural Education in 1958 to become part of the centralised modernist programme for the professionalisation of architectural education, essentially to move in with an existing university. And the subsequent hard-fought battle by students and staff to remain independent and to preserve the democratic organisation of the school actually resulted in the breakdown of merger negotiations with Imperial College, which was the choice for the university to merge with, in 1970. And it also resulted in a rearrangement of the power structure at the AA, such that students had full voting powers and that the AA chair was, from that point onwards, to be democratically elected and answerable to the school community, which consists of students and staff. So it's against this backdrop of community action and an attempt to forge a new model of architectural education that Anson arrives, just as the AA's first chairman, Alvin Boyarsky, is elected. Now, what was Anson's unit about? From the start, it was based upon Anson's belief, and I quote, that architecture is a powerful weapon. It should be at the disposal of the majority, not administered by financial, multinational and commercial interests who represent the privileged sections of our society. In the hands of the right people, architecture could once again become a socially creative element, not an ugly economic and brutal force aimed against the ordinary people of our society. Thus, the unit was almost entirely engaged with community action. In its first year, for example, a number of Anson students converted 2 ambulances into mobile information communication units stocked with video and sound tape equipment, slide carousels, and printed handouts, and used them as information and engagement zones in the ongoing Covent Garden fight. Over the following years, his unit worked with a number of other threatened or endangered communities in the Afan Valley in Wales, in Pope Street and South Docks area in Liverpool, Ealing Town Centre, and the Colne Valley in Yorkshire. And I'll talk about some of these a little bit later. But first of all, I really want to look at how Anson's unit operated. Within the unit, equality was key. And I quote here, "The unit has always been interested more in the equitable distribution of knowledge and power within society, and particularly within architecture. There can be no question of the unit master being above the group. Like everyone else, he must at times function as teacher, student, and comrade. Our philosophy is basically responding to people, not manipulating them, being creative with them, not destroying their way of life." As a unit, they were not afraid to take risks in their efforts to engage. In January 1972, they visited Ireland, working in Donegal, before moving across the border into Northern Ireland, studying the situation in Derry, being shown around Bogside by the SDLP MP for Derry, and now Nobel Peace Laureate, John Hume. This bad photo on your left here is Anson's unit in front of the "You are entering Free Derry" sign. Of course, Free Derry being the self-declared autonomous Irish nationalist area from 1969 until July 1972, when it was retaken by the British Army. Astonishingly, the unit's visit is in late January 1972, just 1 week before the Bloody Sunday massacre in Bogside, where British soldiers killed 26 civilians. The unit was housed in a flood-prone basement of number 11 Percy Street, a stone's throw away from the AA's main buildings in Bedford Square. A location described by Anson as a scruffy bolt hole for the radical units and independent-minded students, politicos, weirdos, activists, and the student union. And it was from here that Anson's unit operated, but it also served as the nerve centre for another of his projects, the Architects' Revolutionary Council, an organisation which often worked on the same sites and the same projects as his students. Now, the ARC, as I'll call them from now on, was born sometime in late 1973 and launched with a dramatic press conference in the AA lecture hall. And here they are, all lined up, rather acutely aware of their own image, perhaps. Anson in the centre there with the dark glasses. And they're seated against a backdrop of their own posters. Here another photograph from a slightly different angle. And they were calling essentially for a social and economic revolution. Their manifesto demanded the overthrow of the RIBA, declaring that the profession as it stands is a luxury, and that the RIBA propagates this narrow luxury characteristic and is thus directly responsible for the malaise of architecture and the state of our cities. They go on to declaim in their manifesto that we specifically believe that the students in schools of architecture also cry out for a new system to replace the existing one where they are trained as fodder for the profit-orientated one we now have. In the press conference, we could see some of the posters in some of the ARC posters, and undoubtedly such graphic work were key weapons in their armoury. These are clearly shock tactics, and in nearly all the projects the ARC undertake, such posters, flyers, and other graphics are used as means to politicise, to alert, to awaken, and to stir the local community into action. Often the ARC's campaigns were actually chosen either through the ARC being approached by existing community groups or individuals living within a threatened community. Yeah, thank you. The ARC would then aim to engage closely with the local people and facilitate action, help with strategy, tactics, and knowledge. Anson's unit students often were also working on alternative schemes for the area in parallel, which could then, of course, be used as discussion or negotiation points with the authorities. Resistance posters, though, always appear to have been one of the first devices that would be employed by the ARC when starting a campaign. This poster, apologies for the pretty poor reproduction here, comes from the ARC campaign at Bridgetown in Staffordshire, a small town threatened with being wiped off the map to make way for a new industrial estate. Another key tactic which the ARC used was the setting up of news sheets and journals to spread information, arouse and inform the local community. The one for Bridgetown was the wild duck, but unfortunately no issues survive as far as I've been able to establish. However, this is Red House, the ARC's journal, aims squarely at architects and architectural students. This is one and only issue. And there's no holding back of punches here. Indeed, the editorial makes the parallel between the Spanish Civil War, and I quote, the community movement struggling against oppressive architecture schemes, in a very real sense, are waging a freedom fight to defend their homes, their land, their culture. While one freedom fighter dies by the bullet, the other succumbs to weariness, to hopelessness, and the unending struggle against a power system which holds all the cards. Indeed, throughout his time at the AA, you can find Anson viewing architecture in terms of colonial violence and oppression. And I quote, "It is no use saying that we do not have wars in our society on our land. That is evading the true facts. The resident moved out of his house, sometimes forcibly, in the inner city is just as much a victim of war as is the human victim of a war-torn state." And here I've got a little clip of Brian speaking in the early 2000s, talking about the ARC Bridgetown campaign, talking about it in terms of state terrorism, essentially. Oops. Bear with me.
One of the things I've discovered in quite a few of my projects is that the government and authority talks about terrorism, but there's such a thing as state terrorism. And it can happen in planning situations. And I've seen it happen on several occasions, and this was one. What they do in order to achieve their aims, because they own a lot of the houses, or they bought them, I'm talking about the local authorities, they then send in a bulldozer, and they sort of evacuate the people, knock down a house, or not knock down it, but it becomes vandalized. And in the end, the community loses its spirit, because, you know, vandals come in, squatters come in, you know, rats come in and things like that. And it doesn't happen always, but it does happen, and it's a tactic that they use. Next slide, please.
Indeed, at Bridgetown, the ARC, one of the first things that they do, one of the first tactics, is to encourage the community to actually break off negotiations with the planners and to actually declare themselves, like Derry, as Free Bridgetown, to declare themselves as independent, not from the state, but from the planners, the developers, the architects. This is one of their posters that they drew up, but they actually did paint the sign on the chip shop here on the corner, and it was, I mean, within within the context of mainland Britain in 1970, this is quite a powerful, provocative kind of statement to make. They also organised a system. The local group organised a system of sirens, warning sirens, so that if houses were threatened for demolition, or if the council arrived, people would instantly move into the house that had been targeted and occupy it. So the utilising of so-called terrorist tactics and using them to counter what they defined as state terrorism must, as I've said earlier, have been a powerful and provocative weapon in the mainland Britain of the 1970s, at least. Now, Anson also brought the Irish struggle, aspects of the Irish struggle, to the AA, organising an Ulster teach-in within the school in 1974, advertised here as featuring the Vice President of Sinn Féin and members of the Loyalist Ulster Workers' Council, together with Captain James Kelly, who had just stood trial a few years earlier for buying and shipping arms into Northern Ireland. Tellingly, Anson also referred to the ARC and its structure, using terms borrowed from the Irish struggle, describing the ARC as an ASU, referring to the IRA's active service unit, a small operational cell tasked with carrying out attacks. It should therefore come perhaps with little surprise to learn that Anson's father-in-law was an Irish Republican who was to die following hunger strike during internment. However, it must be said that Anson was vehemently opposed to violence and was also at great pains to deny political affiliations or loyalties. We are not syndicalists, Marxists, Maoists, nor indeed are we capitalists. I don't think there's any doubt of that. But if we must talk in ists, then we are artists, revolutionists, humanists, and anti-dogmatists. Indeed, very significantly, it is around this time in the mid-1970s that Anson starts to refer to his AA base in Percy Street as the Free Percy Street Atelier, declaring itself a teaching experiment, independent in some ways of the AA and the broader field of architectural education. Well, if the ARC was a small operational cell, the shock troops, then Anson also saw the limits to their role, and in 1975, together with his colleagues in Percy Street, launched a broader appeal to the architectural community to join what they termed the New Architecture movement, which we heard a little bit about earlier. Intended as a voice for change within the profession and a platform for action. Its first national conference in Harrogate, also arranged by the ARC, addressed a wide range of topics, including unionisation, control of education, and reform of the profession. In the words of John Murray, who we've also met earlier, who attended the conference, the women at the meeting persuaded the men that the new architecture movement should be structured like the women's movement, i.e. groups of people interested in particular issues who had come together as necessary, not at the diktat of a higher body or centrally organised committee structure. And true to its ARC roots, the new architecture movement immediately published a journal, Slate, which ran to around, I think, 17 issues and remained a critical voice for change right through into the early 80s. I don't have much time left really to talk about some of the amazing work that NAM have done. It's been touched again on earlier as well. Other than to again make the point that out of the feminist grouping which produced issue 4 of Slate were a number of members who are instrumental in forming Matrix. So I want to end the talk by bringing it back, I'm afraid, again to the context of the AA. We left the story in 1971 with Anson being employed by the newly elected Alvin Boyarsky in a school simultaneously reeling from and celebrating its battle for independence and democratic organisation. Yet trouble awaited in the form of Maggie Thatcher, the then Secretary of State for Education, who withdrew mandatory local education authority funding for AA students. A cataclysmic prospect with, in the early 1970s, 70% of the British students at the AA receiving full grants. Anson had a lifelong admiration for Boyarsky, watching him fight tooth and nail to regain LEA funding, and was full of admiration for the liberal AA of the early 1970s, but grew increasingly critical as the AA was forced more and more towards a private, elitist model of education. Now, a lot has been written about Boyarsky's now much copied unit system and his orchestration of contrasting voices and positions into a hothouse atmosphere or environment, a competitive marketplace providing a well-laid table for paying students to consume. And this system has been celebrated as a pedagogical shift from the scientific modernist program of the 60s towards a more avant-garde conceptual model for architectural education. But by the late 1970s, it's hard not to see the irony of Brian Anson's unit and the free Percy Street Atelier laid out as just one of many offerings or choices on a non-grant funded exclusive table. And I'd like to finish on this slide, which I find rather poignant, with Anson's diploma unit on your left, complete with what appears to be a tank trap made out of broken T-square and barbed wire, marketed in the AA prospectus alongside the unit of Rem Koolhaas and Leah Sengelis.
Thank you, Ed. Well, I think we should leave that slide up. It's just a lovely image, isn't it? Can I invite our 3 speakers to come up? And we've got some time for some questions, which is fantastic. So yeah, just take a seat. There's a mic there. Another mic here. Can I give that to you to do roving? Is that all right? Thank you. All right, well, I've got questions of my own, but I would like to open it up to the people in the room to start with. Do we have any questions? No. All right, I'll give you a bit of time to think while I ask mine. And I wanted to start with this question about networks and people. I think all of the speakers have given a brilliant sort of mapping almost of institutions and key names in this idea of collective action and collective acting, I suppose, which Sarah started us off with this morning. So I wondered if you could maybe each of you elaborate a bit on this idea of the kind of processes of background networking, whether that's formal or informal, the place of institutions in housing these things or facilitating them. And I mean, Ed and Aska, you named some of the key individuals. Claire, I don't know if there were kind of key players that are coming out in your research yet, or it's still quite early days. But yeah, if you could just say a bit more about that idea of the background working that goes into this idea of collective acting. Do you want to start?
At the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned a little bit about workers' inquiry, and as well as kind of being a real kind of fermenting pot for inspiration and ideas, venting frustrations, but also coming up with strategies for change. The other part of that is really relational and networked. So the formation of a group which is kind of fractious and in dialogue, but over the course of, I think we did 4 open meetings and then lots of kind of research trips and archive visits in the meantime. That's kind of the formation of a political body, and the role of kind of connecting together through sharing information was the fundament of that.
Just saying the peer-to-peer nature of that is really interesting. That idea of, I mean, it echoes a bit with Anson's aspiration for this being both the teacher, student, and comrade. Like how you do that in practice is quite interesting.
Yeah, I think, I didn't get a chance to talk too much about the actual atelier and within the AA, and I think these spaces are really important to create these networks. The Atelier was not only Anson students, but it was also various different other units within the AA and also outside bodies coming in, and it created an environment where you didn't know who was coming in next. It was very, very far removed from a typical unit space. And that I'm pretty sure Anson saw that as a kind of fruitful ground in which to build these networks and to spread the kind of the tentacles as such. And I think the AA at that particular point was quite unique in being able to provide the freedom to have that kind of space and those kind of activities. Where you find that today and how you go about creating those, whether it's online, whether it's hybrid, whether it's mixed, I think is really interesting question, how you do that.
I would say what I've looked at so far, yes, there are names that recur and crop up, but actually what I noticed was the lack of names. And I think, that says something about the public sector architect being an anonymous member of a team and the ego being on the back seat, and it's not about the individual, and it wasn't about creating personal networks in that way. It was much more about the kind of mass of them. And if you look in the Keystone magazine, letters written in, it's John from, Lancashire County Council. It's not, the named architect as such. And in a way I think that was one of the reasons that it did manage to gain momentum and develop that mass, because it was kind of the employee, the kind of the bread and butter, as John Sumson puts it, of the profession, as opposed to those named individuals who have the social capital to kind of create the network. So it's slightly different. But as you said, it's early days in my research, but I think if I delve deeper, certainly the connections to the RIBA and the committees and who becomes president when, there probably are some soft power relations going on I haven't unearthed yet. But
that's interesting, isn't it? The power of anonymity being quite important sometimes, especially in union action, the ability to not be named and therefore avoiding like blacklisting or whatever being a really powerful thing. It's just also making me think about this idea of actual physical spaces. And I'd be interested to think about how this relates to SOAR. And also, Claire, you talked, a lot of your research was about the communicative tools, and also with Anson for spreading the word, getting things in touch. It's making me think of, I went to a meeting once at the Women's Library when they were talking about moving from their building in the Elephant and Castle somewhere else, and we got into a bit of an argument about the importance of a physical space. This was about 14 years ago, and it was well, we can do this all online, we don't need the physical space. And actually, in order to be inclusive and global, being online and moving away from the need to all be in a room together is important. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about that idea of the kind of physical meeting and the place of media technologies and communicative technologies in the work of collective acting again.
So physical in-person spaces are really important, but one thing that really shaped the formation and early years of SOAR was our experience of the pandemic. So we formed in late 2019, so the 2020 coronavirus pandemic allowed us suddenly to be very online. Some people got furloughed. That meant that they had extra time for union activity, and we were able to be a really national network and also communicate very easily with comrades in the US and Portugal, across the world. And I think it's kind of a bit of a one-off in a way, but the value of those digital spaces were really important. Coming out of the pandemic, I think the contrast of the sort of digital realm, the opposite is being with your colleagues in your office, kind of the hyper-local scale. And we have branch meetings which are hybrid, so in person in London and then digital for anyone who can't travel there. But as we grow bigger and bigger in other regions, there have been some meetings in Manchester and Scotland, in Glasgow and Edinburgh, but less successful in terms of having one big gathering space. I'm also really inspired by NAM had a yearly congress where they invited NAM members from across the country to gather together. I think the first one was in Harrogate. And it seems like loads came out of those kind of conversations. And I guess like today as well, just, there's something special about being together.
I mean, as far as I can tell, there was no particular physical place that the ABT kind of had as a hub. Obviously they met a lot, but I haven't unearthed that as being a kind of HQ of any description. And it feels to me like Keystone Magazine was the key kind of device through which they communicated and kind of located their identity. And then there are lots of really lovely, and some at the back of the room, the little membership books and cards, very much about printed material. And there is the graphic identity that kind of goes along with that, I think.
I think with the ARC, it's really interesting because they're all their campaigns to do with local community. So they go and embed themselves within the local community. And obviously this is the 70s, and they're doing that in a very kind of, on the streets kind of way. I think, also thinking about spaces for this, and there's Anson himself in the 80s gets a grant from the Town and Country Planning Association, I think, and sets up a mobile planning unit in which basically he buys a camper van, and then with a colleague for 3 years they drive around living on the road in this camper van with all their kind of materials, giving planning aid to all these different local communities. And I think if he had the internet now, it would be a lot easier. But it's really interesting, that question of how much needs to be done in person and how much you can, other tools that you can bring to your fight are online.
I just ask a question to you. I obviously knew of NAM, and it's interesting to hear more. And I wasn't really aware that they were correct me if I'm wrong, maybe this is more Brian Anson. He's talking about the way architects practice and what they actually do, as opposed to the kind of organisation of the profession, in the way that the union that I talked about was kind of, it never really takes any interest in what architects are doing as such, more the kind of background structures of pay and conditions and things like that, like the structure of practice and employment. And NAM slightly different in that respect, and it seemed like a stronger kind of community-based advocacy type organisation. Yes,
I think Anson really comes from his background in this fight for the community against planners, essentially, and against the kind of the wealthy elites. NAM is something a bit different. He is not so involved. He's involved in setting up, but then they all form groups themselves, and the structure is then dominated by the interests of these groups. So I think there is much more of a focus on the profession and on the aspects you talk about, rather than purely Anson's kind of drive and fight.
Fascinating, thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? I've been trying to catch people's eye, but I can't see anyone who does. In which case, I'm going to celebrate the fact that we're finishing this section on time. which gives us plenty of time for lunch, and of course the tours that are available of the TUC material here in our special collections that are happening over lunch. I'd like to invite you to thank our three speakers from this morning for what was a wonderful and exciting panel. So thank you. And see you all back here at 2:30.